In 1866, the once mighty Austrian Empire was decisively beaten in the Austro-Prussian War. By that point, the Habsburg dynasty ruled the second largest empire in Europe, first being Russia. The Habsburgs had a power over southern German states, a question who will unite German states first, Prussia, northern, mostly Protestant state, or the Austrian Empire, mostly Catholic state. The Chancellor of the Prussia at the time came up with a plan to unite the German states under Prussia. In 1864, Prussia started a war against Denmark, in what will be known as a Second Schleswig War. Prussia was allied with Austrian Empire in this war, and they split the newly gained territories from Denmark. After the war, Prussia gained Duchy of Schleswig and Austria the Duchy of Holstein to govern. But 18 months later, the dispute over governing the newly acquired territories led to war between Prussia and Austria. The war culminated with a decisive Prussian victory at the Battle of Königgrätz. The battle exposed the serious weakness of Austrian Empire. Nobody saw Austrian defeat coming. Friedrich Engels had predicted an Austrian victory. The victory of Prussia led to the formation of North German Confederation, which would evolve into German Empire in 1871, after the war with France and absorbing the southern German states. Italy, as an ally of Prussia in the war, gained Venice from the Austria. A country that was perceived as a great power that can go toe-to-toe with any other power had been exposed as nothing more than a relic of its past in just a few short months. Losing the German Confederation, also a rich Italian port Venice, pushed Emperor's attention to his actual empire, something he gladly avoided doing. Austria was a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious state, and every once in a while there was a burst of nationalism, first after the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, and then again in the Revolution in 1848-49. The Germans were consisting of about 25% of the entire population, followed by Hungarians who made up one-fifth of the empire's population. After the defeat by the Prussians, the Hungarians saw an opportunity to get what they couldn't 20 years ago, their own nation-state, but inside the reformed Austrian Empire. Emperor Franz Joseph said yes to all of their demands. The Austrian prime minister at the time said to his Hungarian colleague, "You manage your hordes and we'll manage ours." That's a great insight in why the emperor was willing to de facto give away half of his empire. He was hoping that if he appeases the second largest ethnic group in the empire, they will forever be in his debt. This led to the formation of the Austro-Hungary in 1867. Franz Joseph became Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary. Unfortunately, not everything went the way people in Vienna wanted. The Austrian part, known as Cisleitania, was using a soft approach to the minorities in their part of the empire. They required the use of German language when dealing with state affairs, which makes perfect sense to keep things simple. In Hungarian part of the empire, Transleitania, Hungarians had a little harsher response to the wishes of the other nations. The Hungarians were pressing ahead with a hard campaign of Majorization. Everything in the empire was dualist, including banknotes. On one side, it was spelled out in German and other eight languages of the Cisleitania, and on the other side of the note was only Hungarian. The regrets of dualism started quickly. At the turn of the century, the Habsburg officials were referring to Hungary as the "internal enemy", and by the 1905 there were military plans of invasion of Hungary being drafted. However, by that time Hungary developed its own armed forces, Honved. In theory, they were only National Guard, like the Austrian Landwehr, because Hungary still had to contribute regiments of conscripts to Austro-Hungarian Imperial and Royal Joint Army that used German as a language of command. But in the 1867 settlement, the ratio of conscripts between Honved and Joint Army was never established, so Hungarian parliament just bulked the National Guard and started the Joint Army. even though less than 45% of the conscripts were actually Hungarians coming from Hungary. The Hungarian plan was simple: obstruct the joint army in every possible way, either by reducing the number of conscripts that are being sent or by vetoing army budget, because, you guessed it, the budget had to be approved by both parliaments. The Austro-Hungarian army had a budget of 439 million crowns in 1900, which represented only 35% of Britain's defense budget, 40% of Russian, 40% of German, 45% of France. If you want to maintain your status as a great power, and not solely as a regional Balkan power, that's not a good sign. After he lost to Prussia to Central Europe, the emperor and people around him decided to go south, to Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, and finally getting to Salonika in Greece, getting new ports in the Mediterranean Sea. In 1878, Bosnia and Herzegovina was occupied and then annexed in 1908. Austro-Hungary thought that as Ottoman Empire is getting weaker, that they should expand to their previously owned territories. Unfortunately for Vienna, the new states in the Balkans had other plans. In 1912, Greece, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Serbia took huge chunks of territory previously owned by the Ottomans. Franz Joseph decided to show all the might of the empire to those Balkan states, and he ordered a mobilization to scare them away. He ordered a mobilization of 5 corps to terrify Serbs to make them retreat from Albania. And nothing happened. The Hungarian parliament refused funds. Desperate, the emperor had to borrow from American firm $25 million to show his force. And when he finally got his army, the Slavs in the army started singing Serbian anthem and cursed the emperor. The Austrians concluded that Serbia, who doubled its territory after the war, could mobilize up to 400,000 soldiers, which was more than the standing army of Austro-Hungary, which numbered around 335,000, or 48 divisions. Just for comparison, Serbia had between 4 and 5 million people, and Austro-Hungary 51 million people. In 1913, a Vienna newspaper had a title "Austria is the loser of Europe". At this point, it was a race to the bottom between Austro-Hungary and Ottoman Empire. The name alone, Austro-Hungary, is misleading when we know that over 50% of the population were Slavs. Hungary also refused to increase the amount of recruits based on population increase from 1889 onwards. So even when population reached 50 million, the pool of recruitment was still considered to be 37 million. In 1900, one man out of 132 was a soldier in Austria. In France, it was one in 65, in Germany one in 94, and in Russia one in 98. When it came to artillery, Austrians also lagged. They had one gun per 338 troops, while Germans and French had one gun per 195 troops. Finally, in 1903, the Hungarians agreed to grant an additional 24,000 recruits per year, but at a heavy price. Hungarian emblems would now be fixed to Austro-Hungarian troops raised in Hungary, which was a huge blow to joint army, and from now on, Honved National Guard of Hungary would be allowed to own artillery. Giving artillery to Honved was taking the upper hand from Austrians in case of civil war. When it came to the officers, the situation was also dire. With 20,000 for an army of 335,000 in 1913, it had the highest ratio of officers to troops of any great power, and besides the active officers, the army had to pay massive amounts for pensions. In 1910, there was 33 active three-star generals and 3 times as many living in retirement. Another problem was that up to 1866, the officer corps was mainly filled with aristocracy, and on junior levels by sons of rich peasants. But at the turn of the century, all officer corps was filled mostly by people of lower social and economic status. When it came to commanding the army, which was mostly composed of peasantry, aristocracy had a gift for commanding because they were under the impression that they were born to do so. More talented people decided to pursue their happiness in other branches of industry, ignoring the army. And of course, the language was another problem. Soldiers were required to remember up to 80 German phrases, and lower officers were supposed to speak language of the troops and German, so they can communicate with officers above them and troops below them. The efforts to influence Serbia economically ended up to be a disaster. Austro-Hungary, as the closest neighboring country, was the biggest trade partner of Serbia for a long time. In 1906, Serbia was importing 60% of its total import from Austro-Hungary. Austria was also a main export destination for Serbian goods, mainly pigs, cattle, wheat, and corn. However, the Austrian landowners wanted to restrict import from Serbia because import was also dropping prices of their products. The government finally caved and introduced 400% increase in tariffs, which just caused Serbia to introduce their own tariffs on imported goods from Austria, effectively stopping most of trade between two countries. The American ambassador even said that he doesn't understand what was Austro-Hungary trying to do, because this gave them opportunity to draw a wedge between political and business elites in Serbia by increasing economic ties. The so-called Pig War is just one example of short-sightedness of the Austro-Hungarian government. Bottom line, the reasons of Austro-Hungarian doing so poorly in World War One is outdated, ineffective, short-sighted government and undermanned, underfunded, and under-equipped military.